This is the first time I've given this talk, so I seriously and sincerely would love your feedback about it afterwards, but not during. So the 7 Righteous Fights is my talk about things that make me crazy when people do them over and over again. And there are a lot of things we could include in these 7, but we're just going to go with some interface ones for now. It's been 20 years since I learned HTML. I learned it in an English class, of all things. We did Arthurian legends as linked stories, which was really pretty cool. And it turns out that that changed the whole track of my life, is knowing HTML got me into tech writing. In the time that I've been doing tech writing, I've documented at least 10 new products. And they're new, like somebody came up with an idea and nobody had written documentation for them yet. What I've done is I'm trained to observe, integrate, analyze, and regurgitate data, and I've realized that there's a pattern. And everybody settles into a part of software development that they find comfortable. Some people really find it comfortable to work with established software, and there are rules and procedures, and you know when you're getting it right. I am a person who really likes to work with new baby software that is just emerging into the world like a tender little bud. Tender little bud always has the same problem. The tender little bud always has the same problem because of money. We need to talk about compound interest. Who among you has sat through your HR or somebody explaining to you how saving now is going to make you more money in the future because compound interest? Yeah? Yeah. Compound interest works the other way too. Compound interest works for technical debt. If you have technical debt at the very start of your project, that technical debt will compound and get worse as your project matures. So Melly talked about this in her keynote, how learning can compound over time, but this is the dark side. So here's an example. I was working with a startup that was pushing super hard to get their product ready to demo at a big industry conference. They were stripping out everything they didn't need so that they could get something done. And I was helping them. We were stripping out all sorts of features. We're like, we can't get that done. So we presented at the conference, and people were like, wow, that's an amazing product. I really want to buy it. And the first people who wanted to do a proof of concept were from Brazil. And we had stripped out all the internationalization stuff and hand-coded all of the labels in English. Because, anybody been on that project? You hand-coded all the labels in English? Right? And so there were 2 ways to fix it. Oh, sorry. We could hack out a branch just for this Brazilian company, fork it out, and hand-code all the labels in Portuguese. Or we could do it right, strip out all the labels, and make them referred to a file. So guess which one we did? Yeah, we did the 5 days, and then we had to go back later and do the 2 weeks. But it would have taken so little time to leave that in. That was our mistake, was assuming that we didn't have time to do something right. So, leaving important considerations until we get a working prototype means that it's going to be harder and more expensive to retrofit. Having these fights early prevents you from doing the software equivalent of poking chocolate chips into already baked cookies. I would like to credit my daughter. She baked these cookies for me so I could take this picture. It turns out that this is not stock photography common to have already baked cookies that you can put chocolate chips on. So thank you, Carolyn. She's about to turn 11. I'm super proud. So the first fight that you should be having, localization. We just talked about this, localization. Are you ever planning to sell this product to somebody who doesn't live in your country or speak English? Unless you are 18F, which is specifically targeted to people who live in America but don't always speak English, then you're going to need to do localization eventually, as long as your product is succeeding. Maybe not this release, maybe not next release, but soon, and you had better plan for it. So the best way to handle this is to hire a localization consultant for a couple days at the beginning of your project and ask them what they wish people would think of in advance. But nobody's going to do that because that would cost money and time. So here's what I think. All your interfaces should be text referenced and not hard-coded. Please stop hard-coding things. Please stop hard-coding things. All of your logos, images, and screen captures should not have words in them. I am an opponent of screen captures. I hate them because they are almost instantly wrong, and they don't actually convey that much information to somebody who is looking at your interface. Like, stop using screen captures, just get rid of them. Because then you don't have to localize them and it's way less painful. Please build in extended character support right away. Don't do it after somebody has come along and said, we can't use it because it doesn't allow our users' names. It is fundamentally disrespectful of humans to not allow them to put in their actual names. Build in extended character support as much as possible, and people will be able to type their own names in. How radical is that? Like, be a little respectful here. Second is viewability. We could put this under accessibility, but we're not going to because I think it's so important. So here are my reading glasses. I just got them since OS Bridge because they put the thing on the lanyard, and I kept trying to get the lanyard to go longer. It wasn't working for me. So reading glasses are because I have presbyopia. Presbyopia is a condition that affects almost everyone over 40. So if you don't have it now, it's coming for you. If you already wear glasses, it's still coming for you, but it might make your vision better. But the important thing to remember is this isn't like a disability. This isn't something that we think of as like, oh no, they're crippled for life because they wear reading glasses. People are just going to have worse vision as they get older. So we need to be thinking about how viewable our software is. I had a huge fight, my very first startup, with a graphic designer who had perfect vision and who really liked gray on gray text with gray buttons and also a gray header, and there was no contrast in it anywhere. And I said, I don't think that's ADA compliant, and we're trying to sell to colleges. And he's like, your way is ugly. Like, well, yeah, okay, but you can see it. So, if you have good vision, borrow your coworker's glasses gently and look at your screen. Can you see what's going on with your software? If you have bad vision, take your glasses off and look at your screen. Can you see what's going on? Do you know what's happening? It's an easy, simple test. Have you looked at this on a non-retina screen? I know a lot of people develop on Macs, and I think they're really sexy and cool and pretty, and they have gorgeous graphics, and not all of us are using them or get to use them. You also need to actually look at what you're doing on a phone and a tablet, not an emulator, not an approximation, not the latest hot phone. You need to look at the phone that you still have in your underwear drawer in case your real phone breaks. Because even though CSS says it's going to reflow for you and people are like, yes, we've coded this so it's all beautiful, you still have to check their work. 8% of men are colorblind in some way or another. Strangely, that 8% never becomes graphic designers, as near as I can tell. However, 8% of your male users have some trouble perceiving color, and if you are using red-green stoplights, please stop. Please stop. We can't tell. 1 in 200 women is also colorblind, and so we don't get as much press. But using color as the only definitive difference between two states is terrible. Fight number 3, extensibility. So, what makes you think that this API you are writing is always going to be internal? On a recent contract, we started to create APIs for our internal services like you do, and we bodged them together like you do, and we named them after products that had actually died and were never going to be released with these like weird internal joke names. This was all super until somebody said, we don't want to use your interface, we want to use your program, but we're going to use an API on top of it, or use your API. That was a really awkward weekend because we had to go in and take out all our super jokey names. And I had said at the beginning, like, why don't we just create this API to a standard and document it the easy way? And they were like, oh, it's internal, don't worry about it. Your tech writers are for external documents only. Yup. So Melly's keynote this morning mentioned that Ruby is so vibrant as a community because it's extensible. What can you do that would make your product more extensible, more configurable, and easier to put into the ecosystem you are trying to serve? I always explain APIs as a sort of Lego connector between a given piece of software or data and anything else someone chooses to stick on it. I think Miguel's explanation was a little more elegant, but Legos. I should have brought a picture of the bizarre Lego creations my kids make because they use that interface for all sorts of things I could never imagine, like Play-Doh. And it only works because the interface is standard. Make your APIs standard and document them well. Documentation. You knew I was going to get here. I'm a technical writer. I'm not going to let you off the hook on this one, right? So, people do not buy software based solely on PowerPoints and technical demonstrations. You need public documentation, and the documents have to be more useful than Stack Overflow, which I will talk to you more about tomorrow. They also have to be publicly accessible. I have this fight all the time. It is remotely possible that someone could reverse engineer your amazing piece of software from the user documentation alone. Spooky. But it is entirely true that people make purchasing decisions based on the quality and accessibility of your documentation. Some software is so useful that we were willing to put up with mediocre documentation, IBM. Some software is so well designed and internally documented and usable that you don't really need documentation to make a decision about it. Hi, Slack. And the vast majority of software is in the middle. Not famous enough to tempt people past bad documents, not easy enough that you can get away without documents. All other competitors being equal, people will choose the software with good documents because that's the one they can make a decision about. How often have you read Amazon reviews or ModCloth descriptions or talk descriptions and made a decision based on a summary about what you are going to spend your money and time on? All the time, right? But if you've hidden your user documentation behind a login firewall, people are bouncing off it. I bounce out of these all the time. I'm like, let me see, I could read your documentation and sign up for spam, or I could go look at something else, anything else in the world. Because once I give you my username, which is always my email, I know what's going to happen to my inbox. Documentation is not a state secret. Documentation is self-promotion. Please stop locking it up. So it actually turns out that user documents are easy to retrofit. I can come in and do a year's worth of development in 2 months of documentation. That's not, like user documentation, that's not too hard. Here are the things that you have to be documenting in real time. Developer onboarding. Imagine if you had a task that took 10 hours a week of your developer time every week. I'm telling you, you do, and it's onboarding other developers. You are, at this stage in development, trying to add developers as fast as humanly possible. And you're also trying not to slow down the existing developers you have because they keep answering the same question over and over. Take some time, write down the onboarding process, and make sure that everybody has access to it. If you cannot get your developers to agree to an onboarding process, you have another problem. Make your build engineer write down what they do. Build engineers are the most fragile structure that we don't talk about because if you don't have your build engineers process, you cannot produce your software. You can't do your rapid iterative development because it's stuck somewhere in GitHub. You're like, oh, Jenkins, come on. So, track that person down and make them write down what they do. Do not hire someone cagey or secretive about what they do for this position because you will really regret it later. In fact, this should be a person who's super excited about sharing data because they don't want to do it forever. Build developer is not that exciting as a permanent job. So make sure you're hiring somebody by asking to see their previous build documents. Ask them what their process has been in a previous job and ask for writing samples. I know, for a developer. It's weird. Release notes. Who here reads release notes? Yeah. This is the only thing that people who install the software care about. They do not care about the user guide. They do not care about the API. They only care about whether installing this is going to break their software and take their system down. So, your release notes need more love than to be shoved in a README file. They need more love than to be like an afterthought that you happen to get around to. I actually just left a contract where 6 months after they released a product, they were still getting around to writing release notes. And I was not okay with that. I want to attend your development meetings because the only time, sometimes, that a task is connected to a business reason is in your planning meeting. You're like, oh, we're trying to meet this business need. Here are the tasks that will fulfill that, right? If I'm not in that meeting, I may never know what business reason you are trying to fulfill. So your code intent is something that needs to be documented in real time. Fifth fight, affordance. Affordance is what we are implying we want people to do with our software. It's what the interface makes easy and obvious. Affordances tell us all sorts of things about the tiny interactions we have with the world and with the software. Most people talk about the affordances of hardware, which way your USB plug goes, things like that. But software also offers us affordances, the big green yes button and the small gray more information button. This picture is where I cross the street for work every day. You might notice there's a little problem with this setup. The button to cross the street and the crosswalk are not where the sidewalk is. It's bad for the grass. It's bad for the mobility impaired, and I live in Minneapolis. I can only imagine what it's going to be like when they start plowing all of the snow off the sidewalk, and I have to climb Mount Snow to get to the crosswalk button. It's super awesome. This is bad affordance, and sometimes you are doing this with software because you are putting things where they ought to be instead of where the user is actually going to use them. The righteous fight in affordance is to figure out how not to get in people's way. So often we code things that are easy for us, but not the user. How much work does it take to accomplish something? Start with using the software to perform a task while using elevated privileges, like this fine lady. Then try it again with no privileges. Do you want to have to live like that every day? Do you want to have to go through all of the little hoops that you have to do if you don't have extensive privileges? Don't code that. Affordances can also be used in excellent ways. There's a nudge system that we talked about in a book that I've forgotten the name of. But the rounding up your dollar amount to savings, that's an excellent, useful affordance. It's a no-effort way for you to increase your savings amount. It makes it easier to do the long-term productive thing. Is there something in your software that you could be doing that would make a nudge toward better behavior for your users? Consider task frequency for your users. The most interesting or complicated thing for us is almost never the thing that they do most often. This is a homunculus. It is distorted because it represents the nerves reporting sensation as opposed to our perception of our bodies as a visual unit. Your perspective is equally distorted when compared to that of your users because we're all doing different things. We promise ourselves that we are going to go back and fix something kludgy or ugly later. Here's the secret. You will never be able to fix it later. By the time you have enough time to breathe and refactor the interface, you will have enough users that they will push back and say, hey, no, that's not how my workflow works now. I'm adapted to this now. You are moving my cheese and I am angry. You have messed up my system. I do not want you to change this for the better because I don't like change, right? I've been that person. I'm like, oh, you took away my broken thing. I'm kind of pissed off about that. Fight number 6, acceptance. Have you ever shown this to any actual humans who are like your user? Find a user. This is not the same as the people who you are selling the product to. This is a fatally easy mistake. You go to conferences and you sell to business people, but they are not the people who are sitting in the cubicle or the fire truck or wherever it is that they have to use this software every day. Find one of those people. Find 5 of those people. You don't need statistical significance for this early stage test. You just need to hear something from outside of your echo chamber. Show them the product. You can use a mock-up if you need to, but don't ask them how they work. Ask them what they are trying to do. And if you already know that, give them all the same script of tasks to perform for consistency. Shut up and watch. No, shut up. Don't help them. Don't explain how you meant it to work. Just ask them to perform a task and see how it goes. Take notes. It's lovely to have a big, expensive testing center like Microsoft and Intel have with the two-way mirrors and the microphones and the cameras. You don't need that. You can learn enough to be useful with a WebEx and some listening skills. In my experience, user interface designers get hired much earlier in the process than user experience designers. And I understand you have to build software, but it's equally important to build software that works. If you can't get people to agree to hiring user experience, learn how to do it yourself. Nobody is ever going to say you are less of a good developer because you know how people work. It's not going to be a problem. The last fight is accessibility. We all use computers in different ways. Does your software allow for that? Here are some ways you can add accessibility with relatively little effort. Universal design is keeping all users in mind. Originally, curb cuts were designed for wheelchair users, but have you ever dragged a rolling suitcase across the city? Or a stroller? Curb cuts help you too. Descriptive links take an extra 30 seconds to put in, but they keep a screen reader from looking like this. It returns a sea of nothing but identical links if you say, click here. But if you say, click on this to read more about whatever it is, then they know where they're going. It also reassures people who are link hoverers, like me, and other people who are security nerds, that we're actually going someplace reasonable. This may shock you, but not everybody has broadband, and not everyone has employer subsidies for their cell phone data, and sending people video that starts without their action is rude. Please don't do it. There are lots of other reasons people don't have infinite access to the internet or infinite data amounts. I worked on the Microsoft Server team for a while, and I fought and lost a righteous fight there. Lots of Windows documentation was moving to an on-demand model where it downloaded the newest, hottest documentation the moment you needed it, and they were going to do that with Server too. And I was really upset about this because I know a lot of sysadmins, and I know that one of the places we install Windows Server is in server rooms. And I know that one of the things that we do with servers is not let them touch the internet, because it's dirty and gross out there, and we don't want our servers touching it. So saying you have to leave a hole in your firewall for us to download documentation to you was grossly tone deaf. It's impossible to get a firewall exception for downloading unknown documents onto your server, into your server room. That's just not okay. But I didn't win that argument because when you're working on Windows Server, you're connected to super fast internet all the time. It doesn't occur to you that not everybody is living like that. So cell phones have changed a lot, but what I've noticed is that my fingers have not. And it used to be easy to touch things because they were distinct buttons. And it's gotten harder and harder to touch things. And it's much worse for my father, whose fingers are like twice the size of mine because he's a big old dude. So consider tab navigation, big fonts, large clickable buttons. We are doing more and more of our life on our phones, but we are not really designing as if that's where we're going. You have to give everyone a chance to use your product, not just the young or the people who know where their stylus is, or the people who can afford the latest hardware. Limiting your user pool is a tendency you should absolutely fight against. Fight this. You do not need to cut support off. You do need to cut support off eventually, but maybe not 2 weeks after the latest iPhone comes out. We are all only temporarily able-bodied. Eventually, we will pass into the realm of accident, age, or disease. Some of us already have, and they're sitting next to you, or they are you. They swear under their breath at gray-on-gray websites with gray buttons, or bottomless scroll that makes it impossible to get to the control links at the bottom of the page. Aren't they worth fighting for? Isn't future you worth fighting for? So, who cares? You're mostly a bunch of developers. You get paid to complete goals with code, and I'm standing here asking you to do upfront work. But ask yourself, how much do you like doing boring but vital tasks under immense deadline pressure? Because that's what's going to happen if you don't win these fights. Someone is going to have to fix the problems that you are letting happen, that you are letting compound. So now what? Hopefully I have convinced you that these fights are worth having, worth putting some of your effort and capital into. But how do you do that? You can't fight alone and win. You'll burn yourself out trying. So take the parts of this talk that you find useful back to work and see where you can fit them in. Write a code style guide and follow it. This is super simple when I say it, and super terrible and involves committee meetings when you have to execute it. But the sooner you do it, the fewer fights you have about getting people to follow it. Have brown bag lunches for all of the people in your company who are interested in these fights, who are interested in getting these things to work. When you're pair programming, encourage best practices. Say, hey, maybe we could make this a little more accessible. Maybe we could make this a little easier. How is the user going to use that? When you're coding tests, add tests for accessibility and usability. Just like anything else that is important to you, you need to test to make sure that it works. Cultivate diversity and representation on your team. Every time you add someone to your team, you are getting a chance to have a whole different viewpoint in the world. If you continue to add the same viewpoint as you, then you don't have as much of a chance to make better software for people who are like them. And ask questions. Say to yourself, why do we want it to work like that? How could that be better? Who is this serving? So, too long, read Twitter, I'm boring you. Don't build in technical debt that you could easily avoid. Be productively lazy. Be productively lazy. Thank you. Now we get to have dinner. Oh, do I have time for questions? I have time for questions. Excellent. All right. Super. Who has questions?
The first or second one, we talked about API calls, making text-based and something else. Can you elaborate what you mean?
So the question is, I talked about not making, it wasn't actually API calls, it was labels. So there are two ways you could do labels. You can either name the label in there, or you can put a reference to a text file in your label. And then when you want to translate it, you just hand the text file over to the translator, and they run through and do it, and then you can switch over to different languages. Does that make sense? Ah. All right. Right. So what are strategies for telling when you are fighting an unwinnable fight and when you are fighting something that is going to get you somewhere? I don't have a good answer for that because I am a mercenary contractor, and if I lose too many fights, I realize that I don't think the software is going to be productive in the next 6 months and I leave. I don't think that's a useful gauge for everybody else. But one of the things you can do is find an ally in the design and development team and start to pitch this to them, not like super strenuously, like, I went to this conference and we have to do all of these things right now. That's not going to win you any friends. But you can start to sort of work it in and say, hey, I wrote this style guide for how we write buttons. Can we add that? Or, hey, I'm really curious about how it is you do the build process. Could I write that down for you? So you can start making people think that it's making life easier for them. And really what you're doing is building up all this capital of better practices. Trickery, guile, and deception. This is the only way we're going to get the work done. Yeah. Yeah, he says that he's a consultant, and the way to convince people is that they should have the idea because you put it in their head, and if they pitch it, then you can agree to it, and you seem like a very cooperative person. It's awesome. Any other questions? I cannot give you a master course on how to implement deception and guile in question time. No, that's a whole different talk. Like how to fool people into being better humans. That's a different talk. Next year. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So the question is, premature optimization is a problem, and lots of the things that I'm asking for, although very empathetic toward the users, are expensive and may not be valuable enough to do up front, and how do you make that trade-off? And so my answer is, most of you are not in the position where you have to say no to these things. You can advocate for them, and someone else will say no for you. It's much like applying for conference talks. like your job is to pitch this and sell it and say, I think this will improve your conference, your product, your documentation. And their job is to say, well, shoot, it probably would, but you can't actually speak 5 times, so no. So don't tell yourself no until you've given it a try. And I don't think that's a complete answer, because I think there are lots of people who are in the position of having to decide both ways. But I know that premature optimization is a problem, but I really believe so many of these problems are so easy to fix early and so painful to fix later. And I really tried to select things that weren't on the fence. It's really, localization was the first thing that came up. It's so cheap to do early, it's so expensive to do later. Other questions? The same thing with accessibility. Let me tell you, the federal government is not allowed to buy your software if it is not 508 compliant. So 508 is a set of accessibility standards, and if you don't meet them, they cannot give you money. And when I say the federal government, you're like, well, that's a relatively small sector of the. It also includes everybody, every college that receives federal funding, every school, every hospital that receives federal funding. 508 compliance is an awesome selling point. Anything else? Here, hang on, let me.
I think specifically on accessibility, a lot of front-end frameworks sort of do the work for you. If you're doing iOS development, if you just hook into accessibility, test your app using accessibility features, Apple provides that all for you. Or a framework like Angular, for example, accessibility is built in. It's up to you to turn it on, but it's so cheap to turn it on that you don't even have to do anything. It's like what you normally would write in a form. They automatically do the ARIA tags and all that stuff for you. So I feel like there's no real excuse to not do accessibility. Same thing with Google material design. Accessibility is built in. So I think part of it is picking the right tools to begin with. I don't know about Bootstrap. I think it might have it. I'm not sure, but definitely, any of the large vendors like Apple and Google are going to do the right thing. So.
I know Adobe does too, so that's a really good point, that part of development maturity is sometimes not cooking your own tools, but using somebody else's because they've already made a ton of mistakes and you can cut out that time. Anybody else? Mm. The point is that if you are doing pure agile, effective, accurate agile, the process of user acceptance will take care of a lot of these problems. I have done agile for on and off like 9 years, and has anybody ever actually experienced that where you present it to users and continuously develop it accurately? Okay. I'm not saying you're wrong, I'm just saying real world, I have not experienced that. Yeah. All right, I think we're ready. Now you can go to dinner. I got all excited about dinner.